Before I invite you to make a brief opening statement and then we proceed to discussions, would you please state if you're a current or former member of a political party or a union or an investor in the renewable or nuclear industries?
I'm not.
No worries. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you for inviting me to this committee to share my perspective on behalf of Nuclear for Australia. There's something toxic about nuclear in Australia, and that's the debate at the moment. Fear has replaced facts, rhetoric has replaced reality, The Simpsons has replaced science. We've got politicians posting images of three-eyed fish and fear-mongering about earthquakes. We've got an energy minister suggesting nuclear waste is dumped in yellow barrels on grassy fields, and a Prime Minister who has suggested communities would be, quote, under threat living near a nuclear reactor. Our politicians are not treating this nuclear debate seriously at a time where the rest of the world is embracing it. 32 countries have nuclear power. 50 are looking to it for the first time. These include some of our closest partners, such as the United States, United Kingdom, Finland and France, and competitors such as China, which is building the most nuclear reactors in the world. As energy demand increases and climate targets grow nearer, the role of nuclear energy globally in delivering safe, clean, reliable energy is being recognised, sparking a new wave of investment. 31 countries have signed to triple nuclear power capacity globally by 2050, with the US recently at COP29 committing to 200 gigawatts of new nuclear by 2050. 14 of the world's largest banks and funds, including Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley and Barclays, have recently committed to supporting nuclear, and companies such as Microsoft, Amazon and Google have also announced major investments in nuclear to power their data centres. They recognise that nuclear must be part of a balanced energy mix. Yes, no country is 100% nuclear, but equally, no country is 100% solar and wind. Yet, in Australia, our archaic nuclear ban restricts us from even having the option. This is in the context of an energy, climate and cost of living crisis that will have huge impacts on generations like mine. I was 16 when I started Nuclear for Australia, committing to lifting the ban and thus reuniting Australia with the rest of the pragmatic world. We've since grown our movement to now have over 75,000 grassroots supporters from across Australia. We've reached millions of people through social media and grown an expert team, some of whom this committee has heard from, ensuring Australians can access their important expertise. More recently, we've held information evenings in communities across Australia, including Lithgow and Collie, and we'll be holding an event in Kingaroy tomorrow night. I've been blown away by the impact we've had and how this movement has grown so quickly to become the largest nuclear movement in Australia. And to be honest, I don't think we'd have the same success if there wasn't already huge support for nuclear energy in this country. As of today, I've graduated high school and have entered the real world. Our future currently looks bleak if we continue to go down this path. We must get serious about nuclear energy and immediately work to lift the ban. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shackel. And first off, congratulations on graduating high school. Good work.
Thank you.
Well
Appreciate
done.
that.
Good stuff. I didn't quite make it there. I only went to 15. So, but we'll start off with Mr. Chester first.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Shackel. Congratulations on finalising your exams and best wishes for the future. You referred to, I think you used the term, huge support for nuclear in Australia. Can you tell me how you've measured that, how you've quantified that?
Yeah, so I think, thank you for the question. The first thing you can obviously look at is that the majority of polls suggest that a majority of Australians do support nuclear energy. In addition to that, I think anecdotally I could probably suggest with a lot of confidence that the evidence I see from our support that we've received, we've had over 75,000 people now sign our petition to lift the ban on nuclear energy. This was a petition that I started 2 years ago as, you know, a 16-year-old with very limited resources, certainly fewer than any political party, limited to my bank account really. So to be able to get that kind of grassroots support in 2 years and to, you know, have opportunities like this in such a short amount of time, I think is really testament to that grassroots support. Obviously, I also am able to meet a lot of our supporters across Australia, and they're very clear to me in their support of nuclear energy. you've had the opportunity to talk to some of them, such as David Nunn, who I know that this committee spoke to. He had us up in Callide and Gladstone earlier this year. So I think it's very clear from both the polls and also anecdotally that there is support for nuclear in Australia. And I think that's quite profound, given that we haven't had a major information campaign in Australia up until this point, and also considering that we don't have the benefit of having a nuclear reactor that people live nearby, or a large amount of nuclear experts, noting the fact that we still do have nuclear expertise in Australia, despite not having nuclear power currently in this country.
Yes, thank you. And rather than a large information campaign, I think we've had a large disinformation campaign, but just in terms of the work you've done to advance the public debate on peaceful use of nuclear science, which is what's referred to on your website, how has it been going in terms of advancing the public debate? What's been the demand on your time or the interest from you or your colleagues in terms of people wanting to find out some more of the facts as you present them on your website?
Yeah, so we obviously conduct a few activities. Obviously, we do a lot in terms of social media, which I'm sure everyone's probably aware of. I think there's a huge appetite in the moment in Australia for more facts in terms of nuclear energy. I think it's been disappointing that there has at the same time been a disinformation campaign ran against nuclear energy, which I don't think is in the best interest of Australia. But certainly I can definitely see that there's a lot of appetite for information. Obviously, with our information evenings that we've been holding, we've had people who are both pro and anti-nuclear at those information evenings. We've had a really positive reception when people have been able to have their questions answered and be able to hear from experts on nuclear energy. And I think there's a huge appetite. Obviously, I'll be the first to admit that, with all that I do personally as well, and through Nuclear for Australia's accounts on social media, we have many different receptions to what we post publicly, as I'm sure everyone here could imagine. I'm sure some of the members of this committee have dealt with much worse than we have, but certainly there's mixed opinions, but I think broadly it's very supportive, and I think people just appreciate being able to be pointed to the facts. And one example I would give is our fact sheets that we've released, and I can provide them to the committee. I can. I don't have them on me at the moment.
It's okay,
but I
just give
can
them to the Secretary,
afterwards.
that'd be great.
I will. But we've put together a series of fact sheets, and we're continuing to release them with the assistance of the experts on our team, which are very comprehensive in terms of dealing with issues such as waste, safety, security and safeguards, the basics of nuclear, impacts on industry and jobs, power bills and economics. And I think those have particularly been really well received. We've had people sharing them with friends and family, with our supporters. When we share them with them, they've been really grateful. So I think broadly there is a huge appetite for more authoritative information on nuclear energy in the community.
Thanks, Mr. Shackel. From my experience in the electorate of Gippsland, I've found younger voters seem to be more open-minded about nuclear energy in Australia than the Prime Minister himself. So I'm interested to know how you would encourage members of Parliament to engage with younger Australians and their appetite for more facts. And we've had a lot of conversation in this committee inquiry already about the social licence and how you establish that or prove that. And from your experience, how would you seek to engage with younger Australians to promote a fact-based campaign in relation to Australia's future energy needs?
Look, obviously community consultation and information will be necessary, whether it's from the government or whether it's from groups like Nuclear for Australia, which can provide that for communities. I think specifically in terms of young people, obviously you have to meet them where they are, whether it's social media, whether it's other platforms. I think if young people were given the opportunity, if they knew that they could watch committees like this, I think that would be a huge benefit. And I certainly know of my friends, of the young people that I know, they really do want to have this debate, I think. Broadly, I would say young people are much more open to nuclear than other generations. I think with older generations, you either get them very, very in support of nuclear. I'd just generally say it's quite polarised. You've either got the certain cohorts of people who are very much against it, or you've got the cohorts of people who you don't have to even make the argument to. They're just completely fixated on their support of nuclear. So I think there's a bit of a diversity in that respect, but I think meeting young people where they are, and certainly if there was a nuclear policy, if the coalition's policy was successful, or even, as I hope, if the Labor Party was to introduce a nuclear policy, whatever party it was, whatever government it was, certainly would have to make efforts to meet young people, whether it's in information sessions, whether it's through social media engagement, all of those sort of things you can reasonably think of.
I note on your website also you're strictly a non-partisan organisation with no affiliation with any political party. Can you explain to me the relationship or the structure with Dr. Adi Paterson, who's, I think, chair of your organisation, and your patron also, Dick Smith? What's your involvement? What's the relationship there? Are they on a day-to-day basis, or what's their involvement? I would note that obviously Dick Smith's a former Australian of the Year in 1986, and as your patron, is he actively involved, or what happens there?
Yeah, so in terms of Dick Smith, to start off, I met him after my Senate evidence on the day after, the 16th of May. He invited me to his place after, I think, hearing me on the radio, and we had quite an interesting discussion, and he offered his support to me in that moment. He's obviously a very passionate supporter of nuclear energy. He's made that clear very publicly. He's also made his support of myself and Nuclear for Australia clear publicly, including stating that he has financially supported us. So in terms of his support, at that point, it was really just me in my bedroom posting things on social media. And we realised quite quickly that this was growing quite significantly. Change.org petition wasn't going to be sufficient. So I had some discussions with Dick, and he helped pay for some lawyers to take us through the process of being registered as a charity. We successfully completed that. And then at that point, we were able to accept donations from our supporters. So obviously, we've got over 75,000 supporters, many of whom who've given to us. So we've got thousands of donors who have given in addition to Dick Smith. But his contributions have been made public. He also funded my trip to COP28, because I know there were some questions about who funded that, but that was Dick Smith, and we've been clear about that. In terms of Adi Paterson, throughout the process, I've obviously known Adi for a little while. I met him first in person, I think, early 2023. I then met him again at the Senate evidence for the nuclear prohibition inquiry. I obviously have a lot of respect for Adi, having been former CEO of ANSTO, given also his experience in South Africa, in batteries, in hydrogen, and in nuclear as well. And due to the respect that I had for him and his experience on boards, we decided to approach him to see if he'd be interested in being the chair of Nuclear for Australia. He very kindly accepted that. That's a volunteer role that Adi conducts, and I'm in regular contact with Adi, as I am with all of the different experts that we've got in our group, and I think we've assembled quite a good group, so I hope that answers that question.
And just for the sake of transparency, you have to make declarations, I take it, in relation to your charitable status on how much money is donated during the course of a financial year. Is that the case?
So that's not currently listed, but due to our reporting requirements with the ACNC, those financial documents are currently being compiled, and they'll be listed on the ACNC website once that's all complete. But just to make it clear, Dick Smith, obviously, I think he's listed a figure publicly, but our grassroots supporter donations are the most significant part of our donations and our support, and I've really been quite blown away by the contributions people have given. Also, it's important to note at this time that we don't have any major donor besides Dick Smith, and also in addition to that, we don't accept funds from the nuclear industry or any political parties, political organisations, anything like that. And if they did try to make an attempt to do that through our website, that they'd be refunded.
Okay, and just my final question. Thank you, Chair. Is this in relation to your own, your personal journey on the issue? I've read, I think, that you support renewables, but you recognise there are climate issues that the globe needs to deal with, but you disregard nuclear as part of a balanced approach. Is that a fair description of your position, or how would you describe your position?
So my position is that we need to have both nuclear and renewables. I think one of the most disappointing things I see in this debate is that it becomes a contest between nuclear and renewables. And I think, as I said in my opening statement, no country has 100% solar and wind, no country has 100% nuclear, and I don't advocate for either of those pathways. I think the most sensible approach being taken around the world is having all clean energy options on the table, and that's certainly something I support. I'd note for the committee that at COP29, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency signed an agreement with the head of IRENA, which I think was a great acknowledgement that, the peaceful nuclear movement is aligned with also the interests of the renewable movement. And I think my broad summary would be that we need more clean energy, not less, especially with our rising energy demands. I think it's already been stated to this committee, but AEMO projects our demand to go up by, double or even more, especially when you consider electrification, decarbonising particular industries, which nuclear also, I think, is uniquely placed to assist with, and also, of course, with the industries of tomorrow, such as data centres. So I think broadly, when I say I support nuclear, that's because I think it needs to be on the table, and I think we need to be putting our effort into that, but that doesn't mean we should be taking any effort away from investing and deploying renewables.
Thank you, Mr. Chester.
Thank you. Just a final point of
Yes.
clarification, Chair, and Mr. Shackel, thank you so much for your period today. But for the record, you now have 76,621 Australians signing your petition. You've got to stop selling yourself short.
I guess I have. Thank you for picking that up on the website. So I'm much happier that I'm underestimating and being conservative than potentially misleading this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chester.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Perrott.
Thanks for appearing, Mr. Shackel, and congrats on finishing Year 12. I just wanted to clarify I think you said you referred to members and people that signed the petition.
Yeah.
Are you a member if you sign the petition, or do you have to pay an annual membership or sign up to the rules of Nuclear for Australia or anything?
So no, legally you're not. We don't consider those people members because there are certain, voting. There's certain requirements that you have to have if you are a membership-based organisation, like voting rights and stuff. So we're not a membership-based organisation. If I describe them as members, obviously I'd withdraw that. Okay. They're supporters. So
how many members in Nuclear for Australia?
In terms of supporters, it's at 76,000.
No. So how many members are in? How many people are in?
Directly involved. So I guess you could only count myself and the board, which is comprised of 3 people.
Okay. Is that a public? I assume it is.
It is
registered with.
It is
ACNC. Who's on that board?
It's Adi Paterson. My mum, who's here, Kylie Shackel, who kindly...
You speak highly of the board, I imagine.
Yes, and also Matt Faint. So that's also listed on the ACNC website, yeah.
Okay, and I just wanted to go, and
yeah.
I realise you're not the world's #1 nuclear expert, but you know more about nuclear.
No.
And I particularly want to go to the LNP's decision to place nuclear reactors in 7 different locations.
Yep.
We've been to 2 of those locations.
Yep.
And they particularly, the locals expressed concerns about water. Mm-hmm. We had conflicting evidence. It was either nuclear power stations used the same amount of water as coal-fired power stations. Some said more, up to 20% or 80% more. The LNP have chosen locations away from the ocean, where water is a problem. In fact, the 2 locations we've been to have had 10 declared droughts or 11 declared droughts in the last since 1964. Yep. Could you make comment on the LNP's decision to locate the power stations at those locations, and how that compares to the 32 countries that currently have nuclear power?
Yeah. So obviously there are different water cooling options for different nuclear plants, and that's, I think, been expressed to the committee. From my understanding, I think it's a very similar amount of water used because it is for the same purpose of cooling. Nuclear power plant, like a coal power plant, is a thermal power plant, so it uses it for the exact same purpose. It is slightly more, and I think that's my understanding is that that's because of the reduced thermal efficiency of a nuclear power plant. Now, obviously I think there has to be site-specific studies at those particular sites, and I think there are a lot of experts who are already doing some preliminary work on that.
Do you think that was done before those sites were?
I'm not aware.
Oh, you're not aware?
I'm not aware of that. So
they haven't been to you or in the board or Mr. Patterson or
no,
anyone?
the coalition haven't approached us.
Okay.
I can't speak for the individual experts in our expert working group, but
Yeah.
I think that probably the thing to emphasise is that even if water use was an issue, you can always still have a nuclear power plant at any given site, and that's because solutions like dry cooling exist. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's the most economically efficient way to cool or anything, and I know that's also been expressed to this committee, but I think there are always solutions for those kind of issues. I'd refer to the work of Tony Irwin, who has done a lot of work in terms of water cooling, and I think it's also just important to emphasise that there is a difference between withdrawal of water and water consumption. I think that there's a misunderstanding in the public when people are suggesting that nuclear power plants are thirsty. I think they'd be a bit surprised to find out that water is then released after it goes through that cooling process, either at a higher temperature if you don't have cooling towers associated with that, or a similar temperature if you then do also have those cooling towers. So I think there's a bit of misunderstanding in terms of this whole topic. I'm not incredibly concerned. Obviously, those power plants are where they are because in many cases they do have access to water resources, but at the same time...
also be constrained by that water, obviously.
They could potentially be, but I think the important thing to underscore is that there are solutions like dry cooling, and there are many different solutions.
Do you have examples of countries that have dry cooling?
I don't have an example in front of me, but...
No, but in terms of, have you heard of other nations using that technology at the coalface?
I don't have that information in front of me.
If you are able to find that.
I can take that on notice.
The other constraint we heard yesterday at the Trong power station was that the high voltage lines are at capacity, basically coming out of these sites, so that if the LNP were constrained to those 7 sites, and if they had extra units, they would have to put in extra power lines. Has that come up as a topic at the community consultations that you've done around Australia so far, or online? Because some people seem to have a real problem with power lines going through their property, obviously.
No, I appreciate that question. So to be very clear, since I've been studying with Grade 12, I haven't been at our first 2 events.
Oh, beg your pardon.
So
are you going to Kingaroy?
I am going to Kingaroy, and I'll go to our other events as well.
Better than schoolies, Hank, going to Kingaroy for a community meeting.
I'm looking forward to it. But
no disrespect to Kingaroy. Yeah.
But just to be clear, like I haven't received. We receive a lot of emails. We receive a lot of social media comments. I haven't seen that topic brought up, and I think, from my understanding, if there were transmission upgrades required, I think the important thing to underscore is that it's not going to require any more land than the current transmission infrastructure, or at least not a very negligible.
Might be an easement next to the current easement.
It would be very negligible as compared to the current transmission infrastructure required for our current roadmap. So I think there's no argument in terms of nuclear and land usage compared to other energy sources.
My final question refers to something that the Deputy Chair, who can't be with us today, he's called a community partnership arrangement, which is basically where, my words here, not the Deputy Chair's, but I'm assuming that there'd be something like a referendum in a local government area where a nuclear power station was going, as to whether or not the nuclear power station should go there. I know you're talking to federal politicians, and I'm just talked about a local government. What are your thoughts on that in terms of the people in a local government area surrounding a power station having an input as to whether or not they should have a nuclear power station in their area?
Well, certainly I think they should have the chance to have a say, and from my experience in these communities, because I haven't been to our events yet, and there's only been 2, but I have obviously had the experience of meeting people in different areas like this, and obviously being able to engage with them remotely as well. And I think there'd be a lot of support in those communities. So I think certainly that they need to be engaged.
And decide?
Well, I think that certainly would also be something that should be considered. So, but I think it would actually probably suggest a strong community support, certainly if they are armed with the facts and given the information that they require, because I certainly know that there's a void of information at the moment in those communities, which I think is causing a bit of anxiety.
So you couldn't have 2.5 years of consultation and then ram it down their throat. You'd prefer to let people decide.
Well, it's not for me to make that decision.
No, I'm just interested in your opinion. You've got 76,000 people signing your petition. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
thanks, Chair.
Well, I think broadly it should be based on the consent of the community. And what I would say is that if you do not have social licence at a nuclear, in the region of a nuclear power plant, it's going to be very difficult for that nuclear power plant to operate. But as we see around the world, there is a lot of support for nuclear power plants within the communities around them. I've been to 3 nuclear power plants, the one at Baraka in the UAE, the Vogel nuclear plant and the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, and the support that I could witness around those plants was quite substantial. So, certainly community does need to have to be engaged, but I don't think that would be a major obstruction. I think there's a lot of support in those communities, especially because I think there's quite a concern and pessimism about their future beyond coal.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Perrott. Mr. Burnell.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, Chair, is there any opportunity for the Coalition to have another range of questions as well?
Can we just do Mr. Burnell first, and we'll come to you, Mr. Chester?
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chester, for being so kind. Thanks for coming and providing evidence today, Mr. Shackel. Congratulations on graduating Year 12. Must be a very proud moment, and I'm sure your parents are extremely proud. You're a very impressive young man. So I commend you coming in and providing evidence here today. I just want to take you back to your opening statement, and you mentioned an Australian power program focused on solar and wind. Do you accept that Australia's current energy makeup is not focused purely on solar and wind? That it's broader
certainly the current energy makeup, but I don't think there's any question that the focus, and certainly we hear this publicly, is towards solar and wind, obviously with storage and all of those other factors. But I think the public focus is very much on solar and wind. But you look at our current energy mix, and I'd argue there's obviously not enough clean energy in it. So I think it's a solar and wind dominant grid as compared to a nuclear dominant grid.
But you do accept that there is a pursuit around storage, pumped hydro, gas firming?
Oh, of course, but I think I think it's, to be honest, a shame that that's not brought up more often, because I think that this is in many ways the unconsidered part of the energy transition that most people don't hear anything about. I think most people just think that you'll have lots of solar panels and lots of wind turbines powering Australia, and I think it's a lot more complex than that. I'd argue that gas isn't a good solution for Australia in terms of our emissions, and that's certainly my view. And I think there's not much consideration of those other elements which are going to have to support those renewable infrastructure like solar panels, wind turbines.
So thank you for that response. But I'll go to the proposed plan by the Coalition. It's in here. There's an outline of the 7 sites, and by some people, experts, they're saying that that'll equate for about 4% of the energy supply to grid by 2050 if Coalition was to win the election next year and pursue a nuclear power transition. Do you think that 4% is enough to meet the energy needs if some of the other pursuits were to drop off?
I wouldn't describe the Smart Energy Council as nuclear experts, and I certainly can't be responsible I'm not going to respond to their work because I don't recognise them as nuclear experts. They've made multiple false comments about nuclear energy, including to this committee, in terms of misquoting the final figure of the cost on the Vogel nuclear power plant, in terms of waste storage and management options. So I've also heard that the numbers impacting that figure are based on the French EPR reactors, with Hinkley Point C being an example of that. So, and that's not a solution that anyone is mentioning in Australia. So, certainly, I'm not here to design the grid. I wouldn't ask anyone to ask an 18-year-old how to design the grid. 4% obviously would be unreasonable, but and I obviously don't have the information from the coalition to be able to assess whether that is an accurate amount, but I think it's absurd, to be honest, that figure, and I don't, I obviously take everything I hear from the Smart Energy Council with a grain of salt on nuclear.
So, and it's a very valid point that you make about lack of information, because the announcement for this plan was made, or policy, was made on the 19th of June this year. So it's been just over 6 months since that announcement. Do you feel that it would be advantageous if the Australian public had a bit better understanding of precisely like the types of reactors that may be under consideration, the number of reactors, to better inform what the needs would be to integrate that into the future grid in a more informed way? Do you think that that would help with the public debate?
Well, I think the biggest issue at the moment with the public debate is we don't have any information on the alternative, and I think there's a lot of disagreement on the 100% renewables pathway at the moment because there is such a void of information. Like, I do not know a specific figure on the number of solar panels and wind turbines and batteries, all of this information that we need. Where will the waste go? All of these different questions about renewables. There isn't that solution, and there's even been, to my understanding, independent research released today, albeit at the request of the coalition, which puts into dispute some of the numbers proposed by AEMO with the ISP. And I think a lot of people would also argue that that's very conservative. So I think broadly, I think it's difficult for politicians to provide, to basically design the grid of Australia. And certainly I don't think that politicians are currently doing that with the current approach. Would it be good to have more information on the nuclear policy? Yes, but likewise, I think right now, with considering that this is the approach we're going down with 100% solar and wind, I think it's much, much more important that we have all of those same questions that are being asked about nuclear, asked about the current approach. And I don't think they are at the moment, unfortunately.
But isn't that what the ISP is there for?
Well, I think there's been a lot of disagreement over the ISP, and obviously this committee has heard from AEMO, to my understanding, and it doesn't provide that specific information about the renewables rollout, to my understanding. So it's not a detailed proposition to Australians of, what specific renewable projects will be required up until 2050, and all of those different other details, which I think Australians do need.
I respect what you're saying there, Mr. Shackel, but isn't it fair to say, though, to use your words earlier, that AEMO would be considered the experts as far as the energy market's concerned, and that a third party that's done some consultancy work for the LNP would be and should be taken with a grain of salt? You were just saying that you previously you backed the experts, and it just seems like a slight contradiction, that's all.
I don't think it is a contradiction, because we're specifically talking about nuclear in this inquiry. Now, in terms of the ISP and AEMO, as this committee has heard, they're framed by government policy, and the government policy at the moment is a renewables target without any nuclear. So they're not able to actually consider what impact nuclear energy could have. So I think it's very, very difficult, therefore, to make the comparison between between an approach which has a balanced energy mix with nuclear as compared to a renewable one. Now, do I respect the work of AEMO and recognise their expertise? Yes. But at the same time, I think however much expertise you do have, it really depends on the assumptions that you're making, what you are including and not including in those reports. And as this committee has heard, there is a lot not being included in those reports. It's matters of opinion can still impact how different reports are framed, whether it's the ISP, whether it's Gen Cost, and regardless of how much expertise you have, it is those assumptions which will ultimately get you the results. So whether it's this new report by the Coalition, which I understand hasn't been released yet, which I obviously haven't had the chance to read, that's framed by certain assumptions, and certainly I would say I'd hope is guided by expertise. Likewise, AEMO is guided by expertise, but they also are operated by certain assumptions. And I think the biggest debates I think that everyone is having in this energy transition are what assumptions are reasonable and what are not. And I think you can see by the level of disagreement over the assumptions of that ISP that there are certainly issues with it in terms of how it's interpreted when looking at our future energy plans.
Final question, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just want to take you to timelines. We've heard quite a number of varying different timelines on delivering a nuclear energy solution. I'm interested to get your understanding of what a reasonable timeline would be, and I ask that in the context that you've got several industry experts that consult with Nuclear for Australia. So I'm interested to get what your thoughts are and whether we have the time based on the LNP's policy when they talk about the Federal Coalition Government will initially develop 2 establishment projects using either small modular reactors or modern large plants such as the AP1000 or the APR 1400. They will start producing electricity by 2035 with small modular reactors, or 2037 if modern larger plants are found to be the best option. Is it reasonable to expect that we could deliver all reactors required to backfill coal-fired power stations coming offline by 2050 around this country?
I think it certainly is, and I think the thing to condition that statement with is it really depends on the leadership of our politicians as to whether or not we can get there. Because there certainly are examples, say you look at the UAE, and I know there's been some discussion and debate about the conditions operating there, but they certainly were able to open four nuclear reactors from having no nuclear industry in a bit over a decade. Now, do I think that's possible in Australia? Yes, I do. I would point to the expertise of people like Helen Cook, who has suggested it would take 10 to 15 years, and I'd certainly, given her expertise and given the work that she does internationally to help inform other countries on their nuclear rollouts, I think that's probably some of the best expertise you can get. And I know this committee has heard from different other people on timelines, but I think the biggest factor impacting timelines is whether there is a commitment to have bipartisanship, if there is a commitment from our politicians that they want to be serious about the energy transition and consider nuclear. And if we do have that commitment, obviously make it much easier to deliver nuclear in a smaller amount of time. So I think that's really where those timeframes will be decided.
We did have we heard evidence earlier this morning that from a couple, I think that was from, sorry, Chair, We Planet and Rainforest Reserves Australia, that there should be a moratorium on renewables. Do you share similar views?
I don't think that's the position of We Planet Australia, and I think I've made it clear that that is not my position either. I don't think there should be a moratorium on renewables. Obviously, I'm aware of some of the concerns up in far north Queensland, and I think that they should be addressed as they would be for any energy project, whether it's a solar farm, wind farm, Obviously, there are bigger concerns there because they do require more land, and likewise, if there are environmental issues with a nuclear plant, they should also be addressed. But would I support a moratorium on renewables? I think I've been clear that I support renewables, and that would be a no, because we need more energy right now.
Thank you, Mr Burnell. Mr Chester, to you for just a couple of questions, and then I'll finish up.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again, Mr Shackel. And I don't want to put words in your mouth in any way, because I think you're very articulately been able to frame your own contribution to the debate. But my sense is you seem to be quite technology agnostic on the issues, and you seem to be saying there's a bit of a false choice at the moment between either or, and you're saying that renewables plus zero emissions nuclear is the best way forward to meet our future energy needs and emissions targets. So if that is in fact where you're heading, what's your view, or what's your organisation's view on the legislation which currently prevents any severe nuclear energy? Do you believe that the moratorium should be removed and at least allow the nation to consider all options as I've described?
Yes, I think that the nuclear ban is very absurd for Australia. I described it as archaic in my opening statement. Australia is the only top 20 economy in the world with a ban on nuclear power, and I think that just simply doesn't make sense why we wouldn't be considering it. Whether it is for nuclear in the grid, whether it's for nuclear off the grid, whether it's for nuclear for data centres, I think it is inevitable that we're going to need nuclear in Australia at some point. And I do not think it is helpful to delay this discussion for another 10 years, where I think we will have to find out that we would have needed nuclear and the rest of the world is already leaps and bounds ahead of us. So I think the work needs to be done now to make sure that we lift the ban, and I think that's just a very common sense first step, which any party in Australia, whether it is the Liberal Party or Labor Party or any other party, should be able to get behind, regardless of if we disagree on the coalition's policy or hopefully any policy that Labor will introduce, hoping that there's some bipartisan support in the future potentially.
Thank you. And this is my final question. I preface the question by saying that I find it quite condescending and insulting to the intelligence of young Australians that some people are using cartoons to depict what is a complex public policy debate. But I'm wondering how you feel about seeing the Simpsons cartoon used as a point of reference for a debate on Australia's future energy needs.
I think it's incredibly disappointing. I think young people broadly accept the science that nuclear is safe, that there are solutions for nuclear waste management, and I think seeing politicians share parodies of The Simpsons, I was obviously very disappointed seeing that. We need to be serious about the potential of nuclear energy. Like I said, 32 countries around the world have nuclear energy, 50 are considering it for the first time. I think it's silly that our debate in many ways is being guided by rhetoric from The Simpsons rather than science, and we're really lucky in Australia that we do have some of the world's best nuclear experts here. It's time we listen to them instead of The Simpsons.
Thank you, Mr Shackel. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Chester. Mr Shackel, can I start by just saying that you started this at 16 when you were at school? It's quite impressive, I'll be honest with you there. At 16, I certainly wasn't thinking about anything like you were, clearly, so well done to you. My question is around, I'm from the Hunter, and we've had 48 seismic events in the last 3 months, and people are genuinely concerned. They are genuinely concerned, and I asked in one of the previous hearings if to Geoscience Australia if they had been spoken to by the anyone from the opposition, and they said no. And then the deputy chair said that he spoke to one of his experts that he knew in America. And people in the Hunter don't want to hear from an expert in America. They want to hear what Geoscience Australia has to say. So people are genuinely concerned in the Hunter about that, and they're concerned that is there going to be more seismic activity, is there going to be smaller ones, is there going to be bigger ones? Because as I said, we've had a lot. So people are concerned on that, and we are having a lot of correspondence into our office around that. And Geoscience, I find it disappointing they haven't been reached out to as of yet by the coalition on this. What are your thoughts on that?
So Geoscience suggested that Australia, as compared to countries which do operate nuclear power plants, have extremely low seismic hazard Australia has an extremely low seismic hazard as compared to them.
Said
So I think that's the first thing to underscore. Now, in terms of the coalition reaching out to them, that's obviously something to pose to the coalition. It's not my understanding that the coalition is able to, it has that direct access to government departments, and I don't fully understand how that would work. Obviously, when you're in government, you're in charge of those government departments, so it's up to them as to whether or not it's reasonable that they would have reached out, and I guess you can also make your own conclusions. But I think from my perspective, I obviously appreciate that concern, but I don't fully understand the argument. I've been to a nuclear power plant on the Ring of Fire, the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant on the coast of California. That's operated safely for decades. Its licence has recently been renewed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. There are obviously a lot of concerns, given that plant is literally on the Ring of Fire near the San Andreas Fault, in terms of, the seismic activity potentially impacting that power plant, but it is being assessed independently by the government regulator to be safe. And that goes for all nuclear power plants worldwide, which do operate in areas of major seismic activity. Approximately 20% of nuclear reactors worldwide operate in areas of major seismic activity. So, for instance, US, Japan, South Korea, and they've operated safely there for decades. And why is that? It's the combination of government regulation systems. We certainly have those regulatory systems in Australia. I understand that a seismic assessment was done for the Lucas Heights reactor with Opal. But in addition to that, the International Atomic Energy Agency has guidelines for seismic design of nuclear power stations, and there hasn't been a major incident at a nuclear power plant directly as a result of an earthquake, noting, of course, that there was that tsunami which did cause the Fukushima accident. So from my position, I think it's been demonstrated that nuclear power plants have been built to withstand earthquakes. They're built to withstand some pretty crazy things. They're built to withstand A380s flying into them, all of these different factors. So did I feel unsafe at the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant? No, maybe I felt more unsafe with all the guns pointed at us thanks to the nuclear security. But, it's certainly been demonstrated around the world. And I think when we look back at Australia, considering that those earthquakes, when you consider the scale and magnitude of them, are hundreds of times smaller in their strength than these earthquakes, which nuclear reactors have survived, I'm not concerned. And the last thing I'd probably raise is that in recent days, obviously Japan, following Fukushima, with that earthquake, they did shut down a lot of reactors. I think it was around 20, which were placed in suspended operation. Many of them are now re-entering operation, including the reactor which was at the closest to the Fukushima earthquake epicentre. So I think that's quite a good indication as well that even in a country like Japan, which obviously has a lot of seismic activity, they've still identified it as safe with reactors which are quite old, not the same designs as we would see, rolled out in Australia, that it is safe, and for that reason I'm not concerned. But certainly I talked to the experts on our team about this, and I think they share the same views as I do.
Very good. No, I wouldn't say it's an argument between the people in the Hunter. Yeah. It's a genuine concern about the people in the Hunter, whether they're going to do the right due diligence to be able to make sure there can be a reactor there. That is what the genuine concern is.
And obviously, I know it's been noted in this committee process that there would have to be those, seismic reviews of whatever site you'd have a nuclear power plant, and there are obviously reviews that would always have to be considered for a nuclear power plant around the world. Do I think that's going to, excessively add to the time? No, because it's just, I guess, assumed that process would have to be undertaken, and obviously we'd have no concerns with that being taken place.
No worries. And my final question is, Claire Savage from the Australian Energy Regulator, this is something that she said a little while ago, and it's around timelines and about getting the states to work together with the federal government of the day. When we did the National Energy Customer Framework, that was literally just developing the rules for the retail energy market regulation in Australia, and it involved the Commonwealth and the states and territories. I was in government then. We stated we started in 2004, and it was legislated in 2012. Then the legislation began in 2013. Queensland didn't adopt it until 2014, and Victoria never adopted it. My question is, from that statement, how do we get all states and territories on board to actually lift this? Because it doesn't matter if the federal government lifts it, because if the states still have it, how do you get them on board?
Look,
and what is the time frame to get them on board when that one was 8 years, and then the 9th year it started, and Victoria still isn't part of it now in 2024?
No, I heard that evidence from Claire Savage. I think broadly what I'd say is this is a political issue, not a scientific or engineering one, which is the first thing to emphasise. I think there's obviously, it's very hard to compare, and I do acknowledge that she did suggest that it would be a similar time frame for nuclear in her evidence.
8 to 10 years, she said.
Yeah, I did hear that. I think it's difficult for me to be able to assess without understanding the similarities with that process, whether that would be similar for nuclear. I think, obviously we do have a lot of regulatory frameworks in place because we do have a nuclear regulator, our PANSA, which is internationally respected. In terms of state and territories, though, and getting them on board, I know there's been, I've obviously heard that there's been some legal disagreements on how that would take place. I think, you look at the comments from the South Australian Premier, obviously he's publicly opposed to nuclear, but I think that he's shown a willingness to consider it, and he certainly said that he's not ideologically opposed to it. And I think in other states and territories you'd hope that there is an openness to it, particularly if those communities in those areas support it, and also noting the fact that a majority of Australians do support nuclear energy. So that would be an issue, I think, for those individual, politicians in those state areas. And if they didn't, if they chose not to, I guess, act in good faith, listening either to those communities or to the interest of Australians who, as I've suggested to this committee, are very much in support of nuclear, then I guess that's something that they would have to reconcile in their head. But I don't think it should be a major issue, and you certainly don't. It's not a. I haven't at least seen timeframes like that in other countries in a similar position to Australia.
And just my final question is, obviously the LNP got voted in up here, and they got voted in on the mandate that they weren't going to support nuclear. That was what David Crisafulli said. So there's 4 years where he's going to be against that. He got voted in on that. So it's going to be a challenge, obviously, when he's been voted in on that mandate.
Look, I obviously I haven't minced my words in terms of what I believe of his position on nuclear energy. I think it's incredibly disappointing. I think it's incredibly disappointing the positions of, I guess it would be every state leader in Australia.
Currently every state.
I think it's incredibly disappointing, their views on nuclear energy, and I'd hope that once they do have access to experts and are able to talk to them, that they would consider changing their minds on the issue of nuclear. Obviously, I think it's important to keep in mind, say the example of David Crisafulli, that you don't. If say if the coalition got in power, the next day they're not going to be putting a shovel, shoveling in the ground, starting building a reactor. There's obviously a process before that which is required, and that would be required for any energy infrastructure. So, in terms of the state leaders issue, I think generally our politicians have shown that I think they need more information on nuclear energy, and if they were given that, I think you'd hope they'd change their minds. And I think one more thing I'd say in terms of Queensland, I know Stephen Miles did propose that he might go during the federal election to do a plebiscite in the state. I'm not sure if David Crisafulli would also seek to do that, given the current legislation in Queensland, but that could also be an interesting factor. And then obviously that would be a more explicit mandate on nuclear, because obviously David Crisafulli, his campaign was dominated by other issues. So I think it's also just difficult to see whether that was a mandate on nuclear, given that from what I can see there is a majority of support for nuclear in Queensland.
No worries. Thank you, Mr. Shackel. Thank you for your time. As I said, quite impressive to start this at 16, and you're 18 now and just graduated school, so congratulations.
Thank you.